So to get us started, I want to talk a little bit about what a corner case is. So I decided to do a Google search, and here is what I found. Now, this is a very nice looking corner case, actually. This is very attractive. It is affordably priced. Um, However, it's not quite the type of corner case that we're going to be discussing today, I think. So before we get to corner cases, we need to talk about edge cases. So an edge case is a concept that originally comes from engineering and computer programming. And it means when one parameter has been pushed to the minimum or the maximum. So, if your car is driving at the maximum possible speed, that could be an edge case. Or if your computer is, processing at the, all processors running at 100%, that could be an edge case. This image, by the way, is an item called the edge case from Fortnite. I have no idea what it does, but it looked cool. So a corner case is similar, but that's when all parameters have been pushed to either their minimum or their maximum. So this image, for example, is something to do with computer chips, and we can see that the temperature is at the maximum, the voltage is at the minimum, and the silicon speed is SS. Who knows what that means? And so this is a corner case because all of the parameters have been pushed to one end of their spectrum. Corner cases specifically have also become something of a buzzword in the self-driving car and neural network development world, apparently, which I didn't know until I looked that up. So in Magic, we use them a little bit differently. We use them to refer to a situation that is unlikely to be found in a normal game. And we usually they are intentionally contrived. A judge comes up with this corner case to demonstrate something. I also found this image on Google. I really have no idea what's going on here, but it looks interesting. So in Magic, corner cases are somewhat controversial. Some people like them, some people hate them. The people that like them could even be described as a corner case making machine. So what are some of the downsides of corner cases? Why don't judges like them? Some judges. Well, they can put judges on the spot. So if I'm a newer judge and I'm working an event, and a more experienced judge comes up to me and asks me a hard question, that's going to make me really nervous. I'm going to feel like I should know the answer to it. I'm probably not going to know the answer to it. I'm going to feel like maybe maybe I'm not a good enough judge. Maybe if I don't answer this correctly, I'm not going to get staffed in the future. This is a sort of anxiety-inducing situation, and it that can be kind of harmful. So we don't want to put judges on the spot with corner cases. Secondly, they can be a bit of a waste of time because if judges focus on the corner cases and avoid the basic game rules, they might not actually know the basic game rules, which can similarly lead to those judges being overconfident. So there's a story from the old Florida judge community where in the old Florida judge community, corner cases were this big thing. They're really popular. All of the higher up judges used to talk about corner cases and quiz the other judges with corner cases and chat about them for hours about how this should work. And everyone was really confident that they were rules masters because they knew all the corner cases. And then a couple prospective L1s went to a Grand Prix, got tested for L2, and failed abysmally because they knew the corner cases, but they didn't know the actual rules that they needed to know. As a result, the Florida judge community completely tried to overhaul its community and how their mentoring strategies and such. And that's some of the history of how the Florida judge community got to be the way it is today. But these are the pitfalls of corner cases, and you really do need to be careful that you're not putting too much emphasis on them and to the detriment of the judges that you're talking to. So what are some of the benefits of corner cases? Well, I found this company on Facebook called Corner Case Technologies. They seem to know what they're doing, so I asked them, but they never got back to me. which is unfortunate. So I had to come up with my own reasons. So first off, they can be fun. This obviously depends on what kind of judge you are. So maybe you won't find them fun, that's okay. But if you do find them fun, that's a benefit. Having fun is good. The other thing they can do is they can help demonstrate useful rules concepts. And we'll get into that a little bit later. But they can be a useful teaching tool when used properly. So how do we tell if a certain question is a corner case? Well, we could model the uncertainty of instance segmentation networks, but that seems hard, and I really don't know how to do that. So in Magic, corner cases are somewhat format dependent. Something that might be common in Legacy is not going to be common in Modern, and so it might be a corner case in Modern, but not in Legacy. Judges often use the term corner case to mean any question I don't like. Any question that is not worthy of my consideration is a corner case. Sylvan Library is often brought up, even though Sylvan Library sees a bunch of cards, sees a bunch of play in Legacy. It's a fairly common sideboard card. Judges will often say, that's a corner case. I don't want to talk about that. Policy shouldn't cover that. There's really no clear dividing line between corner case land and normal question land. So I wouldn't worry too much about the difference. It's a kind of, you'll know it when you see it kind of thing. So when talking about corner cases, we need to consider the rules, the game's rules, the comprehensive rules, versus policy, because they work differently. If you just listened to Eliana's presentation in the last slot, you will know some of the differences, but we can go over them again. So the rules, the game's rules, are designed to be comprehensive. They may not always be successful. Sometimes they'll miss a small thing, but in general, their goal is to cover every possible situation. So a corner case either demonstrates an existing rule or it demonstrates an error in those rules, something that's missing. And corner cases can be a useful mentoring or study tool if they're used appropriately, because you can generalize what they're teaching you to other situations. Policy, on the other hand, is designed to not be comprehensive. It cannot possibly cover every situation that humans could do at an event, and it's not trying to. So it has a whole different philosophy behind how it is written, and it's not trying to cover everything. So corner cases in policy are usually just talking about some area of policy that was intentionally thought about and decided that it wasn't worth including in tournament policy because it doesn't come up often enough to be worth the additional complexity of trying to teach judges that policy. So this means that, first off, when you found a hole in policy, that doesn't mean you're the first person to find it. It's very likely that the people making policy have also thought of it. Not always, of course, mistakes do happen, but usually they've thought about it and decided that it doesn't need to be included. And when you have one of these corner cases actually come up in a tournament, well, the head judge is going to make some decision, but that can't really be generalized because there are too many situations. There's no really underlying philosophy that you can apply to those situations. So talking about a specific corner case like the roof collapsing, you can't really generalize the knowledge of what to do there to other policy situations. So corner cases in policy are really much less useful, and they're kind of pointless to talk about. Now, they can still be fun, so if you enjoy talking about them for fun, go for it. But they're really not a useful teaching or study tool in policy. Okay. So it is time to talk about some corner cases. I'm going to put up some questions on the screen, and for each question, I would like to know what the answer is, why it works that way. If you can cite the rules, that would be great, but if not, that's fine, as long as you can explain why it works that way. And whether this is a useful corner case that teaches something important or just a fun one. These questions are pretty challenging, so feel free to take your time, look stuff up, and discuss things in the chat. I'm going to put 2 resources in the chat. You can use Scryfall to look up Oracle text. You can use Yoggatog to look at the rules. You can also use the Discord bots that we have on the server, although I'm trying not to use them too much because I don't want the chat to get spammed. So if you could use Scryfall and Yoggatog instead, that would be ideal. All right, our first question is, the active player controls Xenograph, naming Eldrazi. They play Charizard, and in the subgame, they cast Coax from the Blind Eternities. Which of the following cards can they bring into the subgame from the main game? They have an Emrakul, the Aeon's Torn, in their main game graveyard. a changeling in their main game library, and or a bear cub on the main game battlefield. So think about it, give me an answer, give me your reasoning. All right, Christian has hit upon a very good point. How can there be a library in the main game? Charizard pulls that library into the subgame. So this is going to be our first lesson of the day. Sometimes corner cases include things that don't make sense. This also applies to regular rules questions. Players will sometimes make mistakes in their questions. But yeah, that is a very good observation. Your main game library got moved to the subgame, so there probably aren't any cards in it. Now, I will provide a slight teaser that there is theoretically a way to get cards into your main game library in a subgame. I'm not going to go over that now, but let's assume that that has happened, and so there is in fact a changeling in the main game library for the purposes of this question. All of these cards are in the main game because we're talking about pulling them into the subgame with Coax from the Blind Eternities. Let's go ahead and move to the answer here. So we have a rule that tells us all objects in the main game are considered outside the subgame. So all of these cards are considered outside the subgame and are theoretically legal choices for something like Coax from the Blind Eternities, but Coax specifically says Eldrazi. So no effects or definitions created in either the main game or the subgame have any meaning in the other. So that means that our Emrakul is fine. We can bring that in because that is an Eldrazi. Our Bear Cub, on the other hand, while that may be an Eldrazi in the main game, Xenograft's effect doesn't exist in the subgame. So so the subgame is just looking at the physically printed Bear Cub card. The fact that it happens to be, involved in another game is completely irrelevant. So Bear Cub itself is not an Eldrazi, so you cannot bring that in. The Changeling would be similar, except we have this rule that says characteristic defining abilities function everywhere, even outside the game. So the Changeling is going to be an Eldrazi, even outside the game, and it is a legal choice for Coax from the Blind Eternities. If there are any questions about that, put them in chat, but we are on a tight time schedule, so I'm going to move on, and I'm happy to go back if there are any questions. How is there a library in the main game? I addressed that earlier. It's there in any realistic situation, there isn't going to be, but just for the purposes of this question, just assume that it's in the library or in some other zone. So Eli asks a good question. How can it be a legal choice when it's in a hidden zone? And the answer to that is the library is a hidden zone in the main game, but nothing in the main game has any relevance in the subgame. So in the subgame, all that we see is this is a card I own, and it's not in the subgame. It doesn't matter if it's face up, face down, doesn't matter what zone it's in, doesn't matter any effects that are applying to it, because those have no meaning in the subgame. So it's just a changeling, or rather, it's just a changeling card, and it is an Eldrazi, is a legal choice. Nothing is hidden about it. What happens to them once the subgame ends? Same thing that happens to every other card in the subgame. They get shuffled back into your library and put back into the main game. All right, so is this a useful question? No, not really. So subgames do not come up in any real format. Characteristic defining abilities are indeed very common, but knowing that they function outside the game is not a particularly useful piece of information. It might come up very rarely with cards like Coax from the Blind Eternities, but it is largely irrelevant. So while this may be a fun corner case to think about, it's really not a useful one. Moving on. The active player casts Shimatsu the Bloodcloaked while controlling Winding Constrictor and Corpsejack Menace. What is the greatest number of +1/+1 counters with which it can enter the battlefield? answer of 2, assuming A controls no other permanents. Yes, assuming they control no other permanents, it is only these 3 cards, nothing else. Someone who's definitely not Kevin has pointed out that regardless of answer, this is a very useful corner case. I would tend to agree, and I have a slide later on to talk about that. So we have an answer of 2. We also have an answer of 6. Those are different numbers, if I'm not mistaken. So how about the two of you debate amongst yourselves and figure out which of those is correct? Talk about your reasoning, because only one of those can be correct. And now 2 and 6 might both be possibilities, but they're not the greatest number. 200, that seems a little optimistic. Potentially possible, but I'm going to go out on a limb here and say it's probably not that many. Carl asks a good question. Well, we're sacrificing these 2 permanents, right? And after we've sacrificed them, we can't really apply their effects, right? Is that how that works? And Sam has the answer, because they are still on the battlefield, so they see the counters placed on Shimatsu. So Sam is correct. The most counters you can get on Shimatsu is 6. So let's figure out why exactly. So here are a couple rules. We have replacement effects. Apply continuously as events happen. They are not locked in ahead of time. So replacement effects, as we all know, must exist before that event. They can't go back in time. They happen before the event. And most importantly, a replacement effect is not actually doing anything itself. It is replacing a future event, and it is or modifying that event to do something else. So, and then we also can apply replacement effects in the order of our choice, as long as they're applicable. So going back to the cards here, what we can do is, let's say that I'm the active player and I cast Shimatsu. So right now, the event is Shimatsu enters the battlefield. And that is the event. I look and see what replacement effects apply to that event. Well, right now, the event doesn't have an entering with any counters, so Constrictor and Corpse-like Menace their replacement effects don't apply to this. So the only replacement effect that can apply to this future event is Shimatsu. So I say, okay, I'm going to apply this event. I need to make my decision as to what permanents to sacrifice. So I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to sacrifice Winding Constrictor and Corpse-like Menace. So we've applied that replacement effect, and the future event becomes Shimatsu enters the battlefield with 2 +1/+1 counters, and I sacrifice the other 2 permanents. But that event is still in the future. We've applied this replacement effect to modify what that event is going to be, what is going to happen, but we haven't actually done it yet. So we are still with Shimatsu on the stack. Winding Constrictor and Corpse-like Menace are still on the battlefield. This event is in the future, so we now look to see if there are any other replacement effects that apply to that event. Winding Constrictor and Corpse-like Menace both still exist. They both still apply to that event. We can apply them in the order of our choice. If we apply Winding Constrictor first, we go up to 3 counters, and then Corpse-like Menace doubles that up to 6. We could also do it the other order and get 5 counters if, for whatever reason, we really don't want 6 counters. But I think in most cases, 6 is going to be better than 5. So what lessons can we learn from this? Events must be determined before they happen. When we're applying replacement effects to an event, we are not actually performing the actions called for by those replacement effects. We are just applying that replacement effect to modify what is about to happen. And of course, replacement effects can only be applied once in the order of the affected player's choice. So we get to choose whether to apply Corpse-like Menace first or Winding Constrictor first, because they both apply to the counters. So this is, I think, a very good question to ask to L3s or maybe more experienced L2s, because it showcases some very important concepts about how events work, which is, by the way, what Daniel's presentation was about. So this is a little related. And how replacement effects work. But it's probably not a great question for L1s, because we don't expect L1s to have in-depth knowledge of replacement effects. Obviously, many of them do, But if you're mentoring an L1 or an L0 that wants to test for L1, this is probably not the greatest question to ask them because it's higher than the expected level of knowledge. Moving on. Non-active player controls Prismatic Omen, and the active player enchants it with Song of the Dryads. What do it and the other lands look like? And I'll give a couple seconds for an answer, but we are running low on time, and I want to get through everything, so I may just move on. But the relevant question here is Prismatic Omen, does it only tap for green, or does it tap for all 5 colors? And then can your other lands also tap for all 5 colors? Taps for green lands, the normal stuff. That is 100% correct. So we have a dependency here. If we apply Song of the Dryads effect first, that will remove Prismatic Omen's effect, which makes Prismatic Omen dependent on Song of the Dryads. So we apply Song of the Dryads first. That removes Prismatic Omen's ability. It doesn't apply, and so it's just a forest, and your other lands do not become other land types. So these are just the rules for dependency. Now, this is a pretty useful lesson, I think. It talks about basic dependency rules. This is, again, probably not a great question for L1s, but good for L2s because it demonstrates how dependency works and also how intrinsic abilities of basic land types work, notably that they are applied in layer 4, not in layer 6. Another thing that I like about this question is that if you think about it, this is actually the exact same question fundamentally as Blood Moon plus Urborg. The same thing is happening. Urborg is trying to give basic land types to other things. Blood Moon is trying to remove the ability from Urborg. So it's pretty much the exact same interaction. However, Blood Moon plus Urborg is likely to be memorized by a lot of judges because it comes up a lot. It is very often used as an example. And so if you ask a judge what happens in that situation, they might just have memorized that the answer is that everything's a mountain and you don't get Urborg's ability. But they might not actually know why it works that way. And they might not even realize. They might think that they know why it works that way, but they don't really understand the inner workings of dependency. And so corner cases can be really useful because you can ask about what is effectively the same as a more common question, but using different cards. And so it tests to see whether the person actually has the underlying rules knowledge and has not just memorized that specific interaction. All right, on to everyone's favorite corner case. While searching their library, the active player casts Pen Glacial Worm and uses Selvala to pay for it, but when they activate Selvala, they don't get enough mana, and they are unable to cast the Pen Glacial Worm. What happens? See an answer for undo, except the draw and mana. Back up. Okay. So I believe the rule that everyone is alluding to is this one. There's a lot of text here, and I'm not going to read it out because it's not important. So this rule does ostensibly cover handling illegal actions. That is what it is for. However, we are not really going to apply this rule here. And the reasoning for this is somewhat nuanced, but we will get into it. So what we're actually going to do is we're going to apply this rule. This is an illegal action has occurred. So this is a gameplay error, game rule violation. Now this is for competitive rules enforcement level, of course. So if this were at a regular rules enforcement level tournament, you would do something different. You would not give a warning. You would probably apply about the same fix since regular rel policy and comp rel policy are about the same here in terms of the fix, but you wouldn't give a warning. But the point that I want to make here is that we're going to apply tournament policy. We're not going to apply that CR backup because when the comprehensive rules talks about an illegal action, that's not just a comprehensive rules term. It actually means it's illegal. And that means that the player has done something wrong and they get a penalty for that at comp rel or at regular rel. We just need to ask them to not do that. And tournament policy always supersedes the comprehensive rules. Now, the other thing about this is that this rule here actually is kind of broken and doesn't really work as intended, which is another reason why we generally shouldn't follow it to the letter. And I have an example of that. So let's say that the active player controls Future Sight, and they begin casting Emrakul from the top of their library. Emrakul is very expensive; it doesn't matter what it does. They activate Chromatic Sphere while they are activating mana abilities for that Emrakul, but they have no more cards in their library because that Emrakul is now on the stack, and so they win the game due to the Laboratory Maniac. How do we feel about this? Well, this is perfectly legal according to the comprehensive rules, but this really is not how casting spells is supposed to work. The player is not able to cast Emrakul. They don't have 15 mana. They have done this weird series of actions while casting the spell that has allowed them to win the game, which means that we never get to the point where the game realizes that their spell is illegal. But that's not really how casting spells are supposed to work. The idea behind casting spells is you can only do it if it's something you're actually able to do. So there are a couple things that we should do here. So the first lesson is that the head judge of a tournament can always override the rules if there is an error. And that is what some judges may choose to do here. I did a poll among judges as to how they would handle this Emrakul situation. Obviously, this is a corner case. It's not really going to come up in a tournament. But if it did, the answers I got were about, it was about 4-1 in favor of not allowing it. So in other words, 1 out of every 5 judges would be okay with allowing the player to win the game this way, and the other 4 judges would say, no, this is not the intention of casting spells. We are not allowing it. And by the way, this was a poll among high-level judges, so it was a bunch of level 3s and a bunch of GP head judges. So these are people who do generally know what they're doing. They understand the philosophy behind the rules and policy. And while it's not completely unanimous, but there's definitely a strong consensus towards not allowing this, because the idea behind the rules for casting spells is you can only start to do it if it's legal. And the fact that there's a way to start doing it and then win the game before you find out it's not legal is an unintended technicality. So when a problem like this comes up in the rules, the head judge can override the rules. That is explicitly in the Magic tournament rules that the head judge has that power. One place where that actually came up is French Nationals back in, I believe, 1999. As a quick story time, there was this was back recently after the 6th edition errata overhauled everything, and they accidentally errated Yawgmoth's Will, so that rather than exiling the card that goes into the graveyard as a replacement effect, it exiles it as a trigger, which means you can cast things in response. And Dark Ritual is an instant. So several players came to the tournament with a deck that was designed to cast Yawgmoth's Will, which allows them to play cards from their graveyard. They cast Dark Ritual, it goes to the graveyard, a trigger is put on the stack to exile Dark Ritual, according to the wording, the oracle wording of Yawgmoth's Will, and they can just cast Dark Ritual in response over and over and create infinite mana this way. Now, this is not the intent. Yawgmoth's Will had, in fact, received other errata previously to make it clear that it was a replacement effect. This was just an error by Wizards of the Coast. And so the head judge made this ruling that, no, you're not allowed to do that. This is an error in the oracle text of the card. As far as this tournament is concerned, it is a replacement effect. The head judge made this extremely clear. There were multiple announcements. They talked to multiple players. They were very, very clear about it. A bunch of players decided that they were not happy with this ruling. They decided to make a big fuss about it. They decided to spread misinformation in the tournament, telling other players that this was allowed. Several of them decided to do this anyway, regardless of knowing that it was illegal. And of course, they got disqualified for cheating. Several members of the judge staff actually went on strike because they were upset that they had been put in between a bunch of angry players and Wizards of the Coast making a mistake. And so there was a large strike by the judge staff. One of them actually went up to the microphone and announced that they were just going on strike because they didn't want to be there. And so Wizards had to make a big statement, and they've been a little better about mistakes in Oracle since then, although they still make mistakes from time to time. Overruling rules or Oracle text does not come up as much nowadays, but it is still an option if a mistake is discovered. All right, our other useful lesson is that the handling illegal action section in the CR is superseded by tournament policy and shouldn't be applied in a tournament because tournament policy on covering a game rule violation is always going to be more important. This isn't really that useful lesson because this doesn't really come up in tournaments. But if you guys people to stop asking me so many Pen Glacial Worm questions, it's worth it. And I mean this somewhat literally, because Panglacial plus Selvala, along with other corner cases like Humility Opalescence, Life and then Blood Moon, Chains of Mephistopheles, just itself, etc., those are really common corner cases. And so first off, if you're asking a newer player these questions, this is probably bad mentorship for the reasons that we talked about earlier. These are not useful questions to be asking someone. They're going to confuse them. They're going to make them feel uncomfortable that they don't know the answer. Whereas on the other hand, if you're asking a more experienced judge these questions, I guarantee you that they have heard it already. These questions are so common as stumper teaser questions. I have heard these questions so many times. So if you want to ask cool corner cases, I mean, go for it, but I would recommend trying to find something that's a little more interesting. Robert asks, how far would I actually back up using the tournament policy? This is in the this situation, I assume. Let's see. So first off, I want to talk to the player and make them aware that this is really not allowed, how they do that. And then as for backing up, so tournament policy, the way the backup for that is we just take the cards that were revealed and we can put them back on the library and put the Panglacial Worm back. Now that is a little awkward because whatever effect is letting the player search for Panglacial Worm is probably going to shuffle the library afterwards. But given that we're not putting random cards back into the library, we are putting known cards that were revealed from the library back, this isn't necessarily a problem. So before giving a final answer on this, I would want to consult with some other judges and consult the IPG, which I can't really do right now because we are low on time. But I think probably if this were to actually come up in a tournament, I would be fine with just backing this up, putting the cards back on top of the library, and then not casting the Panglacial Worm, and then the player shuffles those cards away, which is fine because they shouldn't have had those cards in the first place. They weren't in the hand when they started searching their library. All right. I think I have one or two more. The non-active player's devotion to blue is 5, and they control a Thassa. The active player enchants it with 1 with the stars. Is it a creature, or is it not a creature? One answer, not a creature. Why? My question is missing the word. It is missing a word. Thank you for that. I will fix that. All right, so 1 with the stars is removing the creature type. I agree. But doesn't Thassa, make itself a creature again? How does that work? Is this a timestamps question? Is this a layers question? As David has pointed out, Thassa does not make itself a creature. It makes itself not a creature. Yeah. So our reasoning here is reading the card explains the card. So this is a little tongue-in-cheek, but also somewhat reasonable. So if we look at Thassa's ability, it says, as long as your devotion to blue is less than 5, Thassa isn't a creature. And right now, our devotion to blue is not less than 5, so that ability is doing nothing. We may as well treat Thassa as just a vanilla creature. If our devotion to blue goes below 5, then this one's going to change. But as long as it's above 5, Thassa is basically just a grizzly bear. So 1 with the stars is going to make it stop being a creature, and that's it. There's really no layers shenanigans, no timestamp shenanigans, nothing like that. So this, by the way, is not really a corner case. This came up a lot in Theros Beyond Death, sealed, and maybe also standard. This actually happened at a players tour I was at. There were multiple level 3s and GP head judges who were not sure of the answer to this because they overthought it. They saw Thassa's ability, they saw one of the stars' ability, they thought, oh my god, this is some weird, complicated corner case with a bunch of layers and time step up. I'm not really sure how this works. When in fact it's actually pretty simple because Thassa's ability doesn't do anything. So the lesson here is don't lose your head when confronted with a scary looking question. Just break it down, read all the abilities, see which abilities actually matter, and go through it step by step. And don't freak out because a lot of questions seem more intimidating than they actually are. All right, and our last question of the day. The active player controls Banisher Priest, which is exiling the non-active player's Vulturous Zombie. If Banisher Priest dies, does Vulturous Zombie trigger and get a +1/+1 counter? There's a lot of typing going on. This must be a complicated one. All right, it does not trigger and get a +1/+1 counter is one answer, and I want to say yes. Okay, one-shot effects like these are simultaneous, so the priest dying is simultaneous to the zombie coming back. Interesting. Okay, so let me ask you a related question. Let's say instead of Vulturous Zombie, this is a Blood Artist, which just says whenever a creature dies, you gain a life and the opponent loses a life. Thank you, Pearl. Would Blood Artist trigger? All right, no, it would not. Why not? Banisher Priest is no longer on the battlefield. I agree. There's something more specific I'm looking for, though. So Ryan mentions Graveyard from Anywhere versus Dies, and Robert also mentions that. Yeah, so for Dies triggers, like Blood Artist, we are going to consider the game state right before the event that caused them to trigger. So to see why this is the case, let's look at a card that just triggers on itself dying, like Black Cat. Black Cat says, when Black Cat dies, draw a card. Now let's say the Black Cat dies, and right afterwards we check the game and we check to see whether there are any triggers that trigger from this Black Cat dying. Well, at this point, Black Cat is in the graveyard. Triggers don't work in the graveyard unless they specifically say that they do. So Black Cat's not going to trigger on itself dying ever. Well, that's definitely not the intent. So we have some exceptions for dies triggers and also for some other types of triggers, where instead of looking at the game immediately after the event, we look at the game immediately before the event that caused them to trigger. So Blood Artist or Black Cat looks right before it dies, sees, hey, I have this dies trigger, and it triggers. So that's why those work that way. So in this case, immediately before the event of Banisher Priest dying, the Blood Artist was in exile, and so it would not trigger since the ability does not function in exile. Vulturous Zombie, on the other hand, as Robert pointed out, is not a dies trigger. This is a from anywhere trigger. And from anywhere triggers are not one of the examples, not one of the exceptions that look back in time. So they do check right afterwards. And here are the two rules we have. So Banisher Priest is a one-shot effect that causes an object to change zones until Banisher Priest leaves the battlefield. When Banisher Priest leaves the battlefield, a second one-shot effect is created immediately afterwards, and that returns the card to the battlefield. So Banisher Priest dies, and immediately afterwards, the Vulturous Zombie returns to the battlefield. Now, the other rule we have here is for triggers, objects that exist immediately after the event are checked to see if the event matched any trigger conditions. So immediately after Banisher Priest dies, we check to see whether there's anything that should trigger off of it dying. So we have both of these happening at the same time. We have Vulturous Zombie is returning to the battlefield at the exact same moment as we are checking for triggers. And this doesn't really make sense. We have a card changing zones at the same time as we are trying to tell what zone that card is in. So this doesn't really have a defined answer. The rules just don't cover this because we don't know how we're supposed to. We don't know whether we're supposed to see it on the being on the battlefield or being in exile because they're happening at the same time. And so the last lesson I have for you is that sometimes the rules just don't have an answer. This is fairly rare. So most of the time, if you come across a question and you think it's doesn't have an answer, you might be mistaken. It's possible that you just haven't found the rule in question. So don't just immediately jump to assuming that the rules don't cover it. But in rare situations, the rules actually may not cover a certain situation. That's just the case. Sometimes these get fixed, sometimes they don't. This one's been around for a while. All right, so last thing I want to mention today is if you are a true corner case aficionado, you may have listened to my JudgeCast episode on corner cases from a year or two ago. And I actually made a mistake on that episode. One of the answers that I gave to a specific corner case was incorrect. So if you would like, my challenge is for you to find my mistake. So far, I believe only 2 people have found it, so it is a fairly challenging mistake to find. I do not have a transcript of that episode. All right, so that is about all I have for you today. This image, by the way, is a postcard from the previously mentioned Corner Case Technologies, which they posted on Facebook last year, and I thought this image was a nice ending. So thank you for joining us.